Hi, my name is Carissa Trenton. I work with Family Service Regina in Communications and Development, and this is Coffee with a Counselor. Today, we are joined by Glenda Myles, and because it's Mental Health Awareness Week in the beginning of May here, we are going to be talking about trauma. So, hi, Glenda.
Hi.
How are
I
you?
always get the fun topics, right? Grief,
Right?
trauma. Yes.
Well, it's because you're
However,
so knowledgeable in that area.
and we're all are, I mean, lots of people are experiencing it right now as well. So
That's just it, right? So
Mhm.
Family Service Regina operates as trauma informed. How do you define trauma?
I think people describe it in different ways. I'm gonna use the big T versus little T concept of trauma. And the big T traumas are the things we can all that are more quote unquote real, if you will, right? These are natural disasters. These are war and conflict. These are things like violence or a sexual assault or things like this that no one would really think anything other than if someone said that was traumatic, they'd be like, yeah, that's traumatic. Or even when people think of trauma, that's probably the first things that come to mind, or things like that, like car accidents or things like this. And then there's what we may call small t traumas. And these are really more about the things that happen that we perceive as either dangerous or life-threatening. And often it is life-threatening to ourselves or to someone else, which aren't always as apparent as like the war or the car accident. And these can become also chronic. So there's an acute trauma, meaning it's an event, it happens in the moment, there's a car accident, and then there's the aftermath of the car accident, right? So dealing with that traumatic event. And then there's chronic trauma, which is like in childhood, where there's maybe emotional abuse or neglect or something that kind of goes on and is harder to for other people maybe even to see it, but certainly as a child we perceive it.
Yeah.
And those things, especially the chronic ones, change us, right? They change kind of how we respond to things, and our nervous system, if you will, goes from really kind of normal behavior to what we call maladaptive responses. So we learn, our body learns how to react to things in a different way.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, are traumatic experience then very common?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So let's remember that trauma is our response to an event. The event itself is not the trauma, it's how it's actually perceived by the person. So the war is not the trauma, right? It's the event. Yeah. How someone moves through it, what happens to them, how they process it is the trauma. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so as a result, I think sometimes we look back to the event like, well, what, that wasn't that bad, right? But it isn't about the event itself, it's how it's perceived, which is also why sometimes it's very complex, especially when we think about childhood experiences. Often people will come in and they'll be like, well, my childhood wasn't that bad, but there was this time and there was this time and there was this that happened and then there was this. And all of a sudden we start to look at these maybe smaller events that start to build up into a belief structure or how we perceive ourselves in the world around us.
Wow.
Right? Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. It makes total sense.
And so then we start to interact with our environment and other people in a different way. And so when we talk about trauma, we often talk about attachment, We talk about like the nervous system, because it really impacts our nervous system. So it isn't just about the event itself. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's like, okay, there was a car accident, whether or not there was a fatality or not, a car accident, if you've ever been in a serious one, I have, it's traumatic, right? Your life flashes before your eyes, the whole bit.
Yeah, of course.
As a result, then, how you move through that, the support systems you have around you, the care and nurturing that you get, how you're able to process the emotions related to the event, all will change, right? How you, or the result of it. So you go from maybe feeling like that was a traumatic event to maybe, as people say, well, that was a painful event that happened to me, but it didn't necessarily alter my nervous system's response to things.
Yeah,
so,
that's interesting, because that's actually what I was going to ask, was how exactly does trauma affect people? And does it affect people kind of in the same way in a general category, or is everybody different?
Everybody's different, because your life experience is different in some ways, right? At the same time, there's some similarities in the things that can happen. So we certainly watch for certain things, and I'll talk about the brain in a second here, and some of the things that can happen. But think about our own experience, right? I know lots of people who were bullied as young children, as an example. And so as a result, your relationship maybe to friend groups, you're going to be a little more like on guard, perhaps, in those relationships because of that experience. And so you're going to be more sensitive potentially to something that happens in relationship with other people or other friends as a result of that, potentially, right? And so if you didn't have that, however, right, you didn't have that experience in childhood, as an adult, you're going to interact with people and friend groups in a different way, right? So our life experience matters. It matters. It doesn't mean, however, that people who have challenging childhood will automatically, have PTSD or something later in life, but certainly there's more of a, what's the right word? It's a predictor of certain things. So there was a huge study done in the US. The CDC runs it. It's called ACE, so Adverse Childhood Experiences. It was tens of thousands of people over a long term, a lifetime longitudinal study, that they looked at those people who had adverse childhood experiences, abuse, sexual assault, neglect, emotional, there's 10 questions, that those people who have a higher ACE score have a higher chance of a whole bunch of things happening later in life, including chronic illnesses, addictions, mental health disorders, and a whole bunch of things. Why? Because developmentally, this is a time in our life that's really important for building proper attachment and all of those things. And so it certainly is one of those predictors of, but this doesn't mean that if you had those bad experiences that you're going to have all of those things either.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I think I actually watched a TED Talk with that ACE. I can't remember who hosted that, but that was a really informative and very interesting to learn those kinds of things happen when you do experience trauma. So
exactly, which also relates to when we're working with people with addictions, why we often go back into childhood traumas, because the addiction is an outcome or a symptom of the problem. It isn't necessarily the problem itself often. So when you start to heal the childhood traumas and things that happen, all of a sudden your need to cope in that unhealthy way reduces.
Yeah. Wow.
So let's talk about quickly the nervous system and what kind of happens. So there's this part of the brain, it's called the amygdala, that, for metaphoric purposes, I'm going to call it the smoke detector of the brain, which often it's related, it's a common analogy to use. And I don't know if you've ever lived in a place that had a really sensitive smoke detector. But I remember living in Ottawa, and I was living in an apartment, and the smoke detector would go off at the simplest things. You open up the oven and the smoke detector would go off. In a hot summer day, like it's really humid in Ottawa in the summer, the smoke detector would go off, right? And so it was going off all the time, warning, oh, there's a potential danger, even when there wasn't one, right?
Wow. Yep.
This is like the amygdala that can happen when we've go through trauma. It starts to get really sensitive and go off, sensing us, oh, this is a potential problem, even when potentially there isn't a life threat or a danger. And then what do? Our nervous system responds in one of two ways. It's either really hypervigilant, like underneath the smoke detector, right, all the time, or we become disengaged with it, like, oh, right, like, oh, the smoke detector is going off again. We ignore it. So imagine our nervous system kind of does the same thing, or we respond to our nervous system in kind of the same, potentially in the same way. The amygdala, after a traumatic event, will often, not always, but often become really sensitive and go off, right? Tell us that there's a potential threat around us. And so people are kind of like on edge, you know? I mean, we've probably all known people or even been in that experience of that time in our life where you can just feel your whole body almost shaking because it's constantly on edge and looking for the potential danger. Like we're standing underneath that smoke detector going off. And as a result, we are kind of responding to our environment with that in mind, that everything is a potential life threat. So it's really important when we're working with people with that have a history of trauma is to retrain the nervous system to come to places of calm, of safety, of teaching safety again, of like, okay, what is safe, what isn't, right? And retraining the brain and the nervous system to calm. When we feel calm and connected, we can kind of look at and assess the situation in a much different way. There's the brain stem, the old limbic system part of our brain that is very much in charge of this reaction, right? Is why it's really integral to trauma, healing trauma. So it's retraining the body. This is also why things like meditation, yoga nidra, calming practices are really helpful. And lots of research shows that they're helpful in actually moving through a traumatic response or retraining the brain. There's a training that I did once. It's as simple as this. You can't help people move through trauma until they have a relaxed muscle body. When their body is relaxed, they can be in the experience of talking about what happened to them in a different way. Their relationship to what happens shifts. When we're tense and we talk about it, we become more tense, right? And we hold it. But when we relax a little and then we go into it and are talking about it, we can be with it in a different way and retrain the body to not be tense and hypervigilant every time we go into it. So there's lots of ways to kind of do that, but certainly research-wise, mindfulness, meditation, yoga, anything that kind of helps us relax. And be in that place, which is why EMDR and bilateral stimulation and things like that are really helpful in helping calm the nervous system. One of the parts of the nervous system, I don't want to go too geeky, but I will include this, which is what somebody can do about it, right? Even if they're looking for ways to kind of help themselves cope. There is the 10th cranial nerve, not that you need to know this, but is the vagus nerve. And
I want to know this. You can geek out hard, like go hard. I'm so into it.
The vagus nerve is this really important nerve of the body. It's the longest cranial nerve in the body, and it starts in the brainstem and then goes all the way, it goes in the face and all in the neck, and then all the way down into all of our digestive organs. And it's really key to stimulating what we call the parasympathetic nervous system, which is that what it used to be called that rest and digest. It's like the calming part of us. You know, when you go and you're like chilling out, this is the parasympathetic. It's the opposite to the fight or flight response. It's the calming part of our nervous system. And so this nerve is key to turn that part of our nervous system on, which is also why it relates to digestion, because it's key to all of the digestion, which is also why lots of people with anxiety and trauma have digestive issues, because their digestions, right? When we're too stressed, you know, with all of us, we get an upset stomach, or, you know, where our digestion's not working optimally. Often this relates back to the nervous system not going into that place of calm often enough. So, which is also why the same techniques are great for people with anxiety or trauma, because they're very much related. But the other thing that's really good is facial massage.
I actually have been seeing that everywhere now too. There's this little tool.
Gua sha.
Yes, that's what it is.
So it's a traditional Chinese medicine. So often if you go to a TCM or a acupuncturist, they might use it on your body, but also, and you can just do it on your face. This is also why we think people emotionally eat when they're really stressed, because the jaw muscles help us calm.
Interesting.
Because again, it's that vagus nerve is all in there, right?
Yeah.
This is also why if you want to kind of tone or stimulate the vagus nerve, singing or humming or chanting or doing anything with the throat is really calming and good. And ask anybody who sings, they know it's a really calming thing. But also just humming or doing a simple breath like the I was going to say butterfly breath, but it's bumblebee breath, where you inhale through your nose and then you exhale and then you just hum. Right? It's a really calming one.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. And again, it's kind of like the stimulating, because all of those things there are there. So there's lots of things that we can do to stimulate the vagus nerve, including meditation and slow movement practices, typically, like not a hardcore power yoga class, but more like a restorative or a yin class. A warm yin class would be lovely, right? Because it's kind of settling their nervous system. There's also this really other, so that's kind of the things that we could do to kind of help stimulate the vagus, which is going to stimulate the parasympathetic, but it's also going to help a nervous system that's dysregulated from trauma as a result of the trauma response to help it regulate again.
Wow.
The other thing is, there's this thing called neuroception. So related to the vagus nerve and what Stephen Porges calls the polyvagal theory. So he looked at, okay, well, how do we stimulate this, and how do we get to the place of social engagement, right? Where this is where we feel calm, we feel connected, we feel safe, we're able to connect with other people. When we're connected to other people, we can manage more stress, right? But when you're in a trauma response, everyone's a potential threat. Right. And so we want to help kind of get people to this place of finding calm and connection, what we call social engagement. Well, not what I called it, what Stephen Porges called it in the polyvagal theory. So let's go back to this idea of neuroception. Proprioception is this, you might have heard of it, right? Where knowing where your body is in space. So this is what the brain does to know how you get through spaces, or you're not constantly hitting yourself against things, because you know where your body is against the other things that are around you, right? So how do you get through a door without hitting the door frame? Proprioception is part of it, right?
Yeah.
Well, neuroception is the brain's way of sensing below conscious thought. So this isn't, like many things, this is automatically done for us, right? We're not sitting thinking about, oh, heartbeat. I need to beat my heart right now, right?
Yeah.
These are things that just happen. Well,
Yeah.
neuroception just happens. It happens below our conscious thought. But basically what it's doing is the brain is sensing the environment around us.
Mhm.
It's sensing between two people, and it's sensing within my body constantly for safety, dangers, and life threats.
Mhm.
We do it all the time. This is why partners will say, I just knew something was wrong. Like my intuition was telling me, right? Because
Yeah.
we're constantly sensing, oh, so, and then you get this sense that something's not right, but you don't know why.
Mhm.
Part of this is just we're constantly surveying the lands, if you will,
Yeah.
for potential life threats and dangers. This is like highlighted if you've been through a traumatic event in your life, or that you're having that trauma response based on your past. And so it's really important to kind of go, again, you're gauging, oh, the body's reacting even before. It's not like you have control over it, because again, it's below conscious threat or conscious awareness. Your body's reacting, but can you notice that your body is reacting and then do these tools like the facial massage or something else, breathing techniques to calm yourself back down and really truly assess the situation.
Mhm. Do you think
Related.
that people who have experienced trauma have a heightened sense of that? Is that something that
Yes, that's
how,
the smoke detector, right? Like always on
yeah.
the hypervigilant. What's going on? What's going on? What I noticed thing. So they're looking for things that may not be there, like
Yeah.
because that part of
Yes,
them
that's
is
exactly what I was
constantly on
trying to
guard.
ask. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for getting
The
that.
other thing related to this is often what happens is there's this other element which is really important, is what we call co-regulation. So I know that you have a child, so we do this with children, right? So as a parent, we help them regulate their emotions, hopefully, hopefully,
Yeah.
so that they learn self-regulation, right? Because they don't know this by themselves, even though as parents you wish that they did. They don't, right? They learn it
From us,
through
yeah.
your ability to self-regulate, and through your own self-regulation what we call co-regulate. This is what we do in therapy as well. So it's my job as a therapist to do my work so that I show up and I'm calm, and my sense of calm, my voice, all of these things will help somebody else calm.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Makes total
And
sense.
sometimes that's the only safe spaces lots of people have. Right. And then in learning how to do that, they learn how to self-regulate as well.
Oh, I love that. Can people forget that they've experienced trauma and then later remember, or?
Yeah, so we talked about, and often people relate to that fight or flight response. I think we all know that, right? That's where anxiety lives. That's where, we're really like amped up. But there's another part of our nervous system that's called the dorsal vagal, related to that vagus nerve again, where we go into shutdown mode. So in this place, if we feel like there's that life threat that's approaching us and we can't escape, we will shut down.
Yeah.
But we also shut down because it becomes too much. We're in that fight or flight for too long, and the body's like, we can't sustain this, as an example, right? So trying to conserve energy, we will go into this. This is a place of disconnection. So we disconnect from the world. This is, people will describe it to me like, I just want to crawl into bed, put the covers over my head and make the world go away.
Aww.
Right?
Yeah.
And if you've ever had a moment like that you're enjoying, when we've all been there probably for moments of time, and that's okay. It's a normal part of our nervous system, but some people go in that place. Now, if you're in the middle of a life threat, so assault victims will often have this out of body experience. Why? Because that's what we're doing. We're literally disconnecting from the present moment to protect our mental and emotional well-being.
Yeah.
As a way of protecting ourselves, we're removing ourselves from this situation, even though we can't physically remove ourselves. right? And so children will do this as well. And so we, disassociate, right? We're disconnecting in some way as a way of protecting. And so in that, sometimes memories are a funny thing, right? Like, it isn't like there's this movie that gets stored on a shelf that we can take out and then just replay the movie. Our memories are kind of in association. And so, which is also why memories are not so reliable often, because it isn't like the movie. It's like, and anybody who's had this experience, everybody has, right? You hear a song and it takes you back to a time, but you don't remember every detail of it. You remember how you felt, maybe you remember the thoughts or the feelings, or maybe some of the details around it. So good memories and bad memories are stored in kind of the same way. Sometimes we smell something and it reminds us of a negative or an unpleasant memory or a traumatic event that happened. And so, and it brings up all of the emotions attached to it as well. And again, depending on how people have processed it and whatnot. But certainly what often happens is we might call them repressed memories, right? They're still there, but we're not thinking about them. We've kind of tucked it away because it's hard for them, the brain doing it to protect us. It's like, you can't imagine, again, this isn't exactly, but I'm just going to kind of create an illusion, or the thought of it. Like, imagine the brain's going, that's too much for us to handle, so we're just going to put it away here so that you can kind of live, right? And survive. And so even as adults, sometimes it's like too much for us to deal with. And so we kind of are challenged with wanting sometimes to know what happened, but then also going, I don't know if I can handle it, kind of thing. And I often think, because people come in going, I think I missed some memories, or like, I want to go back. And I'm like, well, it's dangerous to do that, right? It's dangerous to force yourself to remember something that your brain has decided you're not ready to deal with. Memories will come up as you move through kind of processing an experience in a way that kind of allows you to deal with things and unpack it, if you will, in a safe space, as your body thinks that you're ready for, if you will, right?
Wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that it kind of worked in that regard, like that your brain can actually withhold information from you, or a traumatic experience from you to protect you. That's so crazy. Right? Humans are awesome.
Think about it. Just think about that, right? I mean, we all do that. Like, we all remember selectively sometimes our own experience of something and what we want to take with us, it doesn't mean that it's not actually there. The information is somewhere there, but sometimes, lots of people will do that, going, you can tell they have this selective memory about what happened. And you're like, okay, your experience of this is very different than mine. No, the experience might be different, but also how they're choosing to remember it may be based on kind of their own perceived ability to cope.
That makes
Remember,
sense.
going back to the beginning, which is, what is trauma? It's overwhelming our ability to cope. And that's different. For me, it's going to be different than for you at any day. So what I can handle today is maybe different than what I could have handled 10 years ago.
Agreed.
And so that's just how it goes, right? So remembering that it's also the overwhelm. And what do we do when we're overwhelmed? We compartmentalize, we do what we need to do to kind of be able to move through something.
What kind of therapies are available for people who have experienced trauma?
So there's quite a few, actually. Some, I'll talk about the ones, if you're looking at it from a post-traumatic stress, traumatic stress, developmental stress disorders, those kinds of things. The research shows things like EMDR and CPT, which is similar to CBT, which many people have heard about, related to anxiety and depression, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. Yep. CPT is similar, although different, where it's cognitive processing therapy. So that's another therapy there. A lot of somatic work is really good for working with trauma. Why? Because of what we just talked about, somatic being in the body. So learning how to regulate our nervous system, how to be in our bodies. When people have a traumatic event, they tend to be very in their head about things. They are not necessarily feeling it in our body yet. This is this amount and the body is the rest of us. And lots of things, including emotions, and sensations, get stored in our body as a result of anybody who's ever been in a car accident and had whiplash can kind of attest, right? That's the physical manifestation of that bodily response in the moment of that trauma. Well, emotional things happen and get stored in the same kind of way. So lots of somatic work. There's a whole bunch of names for it, somatic experiencing, sensory-motor psychotherapies, body psychotherapies, mindfulness-based yoga. I'm looking over here. There's a yoga and yoga, trauma-informed yoga, trauma-informed mindfulness practices that kind of allow people to start to really safely sense their body, become more aware of it.
I really like that. I think that I actually seen recently that a trauma-informed yoga studio opened up in Regina as well. So that's helpful. I really like that.
There's definitely classes. I don't know. I didn't know that there was a studio, but I know that there's certainly classes and certain people who, teachers who do more of that. I know in my private practice, I do a lot of it. So it's more of that trauma-informed, helping people who've been through or experienced trauma or have complex trauma histories, right? Kind of start to delve in using yoga and meditation.
Cool.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else that you would like to talk about in regards to trauma before we sign off?
No, I think if I could leave people with it, it's that it's, this idea of trauma isn't always what we think it is, right? That it is very much our way of moving through an event. So as parents, as an example, right, we may think something's no big deal, but if your child is kind of having a reaction to something, it's kind of indicative that it's important to them.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter so much what your perception of it is, it's their perception of what's happened. And, especially when kids are like 12 and 13 years old, in particular around that age group, right? It's a really critical time of development and development of self versus others. And so how they're perceiving their peers and the things around their environment around them, and is it safe? And the bullying and comparison, especially these days, really has an impact on how they are now also, but how they are later in life and how they move through it. And it isn't so much about necessarily making all that stuff go away, because that's an impossibility. It's about creating really strong support systems and places where they can feel safe to talk through things without it being discounted because of our idea,
because we don't think
that it's no big deal, right? Or, oh my goodness, just stay off social media or just do this, and it's like, but that's an unrealistic expectation for a young child. So sometimes just making sure that they feel loved and accepted, even if it's only at home in those critical years, is really important for their further development.
Yeah. I love that. That was a great talk. Thank you so much for chatting about trauma. If anybody would like to learn more about trauma, or if you know somebody who has had a traumatic experience, Family Service Regina offers trauma-informed care, and we can be reached on our website at www.familyserviceregina.com, or you can give us a call at 306-757-6675. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.